Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warrenchuk in Baltimore. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has just released a new report entitled Climate Change 2014 Mitigation of Climate Change. The report, written by hundreds of scientists from around the world, is the third installment of working group reports that make up the fifth IPCC assessment and discusses how civilization can avoid worldwide climate change catastrophe through mitigation. Here is a clip from Sunday's press conference in Berlin of the chair of the IPCC, Rajendra K. Pachauri.
That what comes out very clearly from this report is the fact that the high-speed mitigation train would need to leave the station soon, and all of global society would have to get on board.
With us to help understand the issue of mitigation presented in this report are two guests. Joshua Howe is Assistant Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. His new book, Behind the Curve: Science and the Politics of Global Warming, explores the political history of climate change from its roots as a Cold War scientific curiosity to its place at the center of international environmental politics. And also with us is Subhankar Banerjee, who's an environmental humanities scholar and activist. He founded climatestorytellers.org and is the editor of Anthology, Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Antonio, for having us.
So, Subhankar, define for us what is mitigation. Give us an overview of what it entails.
Mitigation essentially means how to solve a problem. And this report, this is the third report of the fifth assessment report, which deals with how do we now finally solve the climate crisis. And it lays out a whole set of assessments. It's not recommendation, but assessments, assessment of literature published in the last several years, and actually several decades. So the issue is that in the first report, IPCC looked at the climate science. And the main takeaway from that was that the global warming is being caused by humans. That was the main takeaway. And there were several highlights, like the Greenland ice sheet is melting at a rate 6 times faster in the first decade of this century as compared to the last decade of the last century. The second report looked at impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. And that main takeaway was that the food, mainly the food security, will be very severely impacted by climate change. This report looks at how do we solve the problem. But before even it goes there, first several pages of the report looks at and deepens our understanding of why actually the humans are really not only causing it, but making it enormous challenge for us. Because the report shows that between 2000 and 2010, the rate of increase of greenhouse gas emissions doubled as compared to the 3 decades prior to that, between 1970 and 2000. And in fact, more than half of the entire greenhouse gas emissions that we have accumulated now in the atmosphere comes from 1970 to now. So humans are causing very serious damage. And then mitigation measures they talk about essentially, and we'll go more into detail, is that they're suggesting, of course, the usual suspects like increasing efficiency, renewable energy, and then very problematic issues like biofuels, carbon capture and storage of fossil fuels, as well as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So these are some of the overall things that the report is presenting. It is both extremely important report, but it is also a very problematic report, because as we get close to reading it between the lines and across the pages, it essentially becomes, in my mind, a perfect example of theater of the absurd.
So Joshua, tell us what you think is the biggest takeaway from this new report.
Well, to me, the biggest takeaway is actually something I really like about the report, and that is that in especially the Working Group 2 summary, the IPCC has recognized the extent to which climate change is folded into a number of other problems that are related but not the same as climate change: infrastructure, poverty, food systems, all these things that are already problems in other geopolitical spaces that are going to be exacerbated by the climate problem, but we won't necessarily recognize as climate change per se. And for me, the IPCC finally folding those in and putting them front and center in that Working Group 2 report it makes it much clearer what exactly is at stake, and that climate change isn't some single global problem. It's a compendium of much more complex small-scale problems that are exacerbated by this global process of CO2 and greenhouse warming.
So let's talk about some of the proposed schemes of mitigation, which have included technologies of geoengineering, carbon capture and sequestration, as well as a carbon tax. Josh, let's start with you. Do you see any of these as problematic, as a prescriptive to avoid climate change?
Well, most of the large-scale geoengineering schemes for mitigation rely on states, and they're very state-centric. They also rely on large-scale solutions, and there are two problems to that. The first is that if climate change is, in fact, as Working Group 2 says, wrapped up in all these other infrastructural problems, you can't implement any of these major solutions without also building from the ground up. What you're doing is drawing resources away from other types of problems for the sake of geoengineering. And it leads into the second problem, and that is that if you solve this problem that way, you give everybody incentive to try to carry on the same sorts of lifestyles that have led to this problem in the first place. So it's like the problem of memory in computers. We increase memory by some astronomical number every 18 months, and people just start using computers differently to meet that cap on memory. The same thing can happen with geoengineering and carbon dioxide. And that's what I fear, is that if you don't try to go for the kind of fundamental change in behaviors and infrastructures at local and regional levels and things like urban planning and transportation, and focus instead on these large-scale geoengineering plans, I think you sort of are missing the major heart of this problem.
And Subhankar, what do you think about schemes like geoengineering, carbon capture, and sequestration as a part of mitigation schemes?
Yeah, so let me correct at least one, perhaps a misconception, and then add to exactly what Joshua is saying, is that a lot of scholars had anticipated that the UN in this report will actually give a stamp of approval to geoengineering. It does not. What it does is that it does not. There is no actual geoengineering scheme discussed or assessed in this particular report. What is done here is carbon capture and sequestration, which is called geosequestration. In some scholars look at that as geoengineering, but it is not a traditional geoengineering where you're actually taking over the whole Earth's climate system, like aerosol spraying or mass fertilization, iron fertilization of the ocean, and other schemes. So carbon capture and sequestration is still considered more of a localized thing. But let me then broaden that. So what is going on, and add exactly to what Joshua was saying, I completely agree with his assessment, is that what happened with this particular report is that, and it's been happening, that we are taking more of a techno-social approach, meaning we are actually trying to solve society's problem entirely primarily through technology rather than an eco-social approach. This particular report does not have any mention whatsoever of the non-human, meaning that all these other species with which we share this planet, or even any kind of an ecological basis. And part of the problem is that even though the report is drafted by a whole bunch of kind of a combination of scientists and economists, but I doubt that there were much of a representation from economists who look at, for example, let's say someone like Juan Martinez-Allier, who looks at more from an ecological point of view and from the point of view of the other resource issues. Having said that, let me specifically mention the geosequestration means that they're proposing, and it's a deeply dangerous path that we are taking. The reason they're doing this is, again, it could start off, and it already has, a massive expansion of coal. So what they're saying is you can keep burning fossil fuels. Not they're saying, it is a realization. Keep burning fossil carbon, whether it's coal or biofuel or what have you, and then we sequester it. The problem with geosequestration is that you can't just put the waste anywhere else. You have to find a saline aquifer under which you will pump it underground, and then you have to seal it with an impervious rock layer. The problem of this is that there are multiple problems. First of all, finding the saline aquifers is not that easy. Second problem is that if it leaks, then it's a very serious problem. And one classic example goes back to 1986, where in Cameroon, in Lake Nyos, which is basically a volcanic crater lake, saturated with carbon dioxide. And due to a geologic activity, the carbon dioxide came out, a large concentration of carbon dioxide came out and killed everything within 25 kilometers radius of that particular lake. Every animal, 1,700 humans, all birds were all killed. I mean, just again, it's an example that has happened. So that problem is there, that who is going to deal with this waste? And if we expand the dialogue a little bit, how we deal with our industrial waste in the recent past half century and military waste, the one primary approach is that send it to the poor countries. When Larry Summers was the president of World Bank, before that the president of Harvard, when he was the president of World Bank, he proposed the scheme that let's send the industrial waste of US and Europe to Africa. So that's one approach we have done. Second, how have we dealt with, let's say, industrial military waste, like nuclear waste? Because this report is also proposing nuclear energy as a clean energy solution. Is the nuclear waste, what we have done is a horrendous example with depleted uranium. Several 100 million tons of depleted uranium, which was basically a bunch of people came to the idea that one way we can get rid of the depleted uranium is by putting it in front of bullets and dump it on Iraq. That's exactly what US and UK have done, is several 100 million tons of depleted uranium now existing in Iraq in some places with congenital deformity, 14 times larger than even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So now with that context, historical context, we are proposing carbon capture and storage for fossil fuel burning. And I think it's a deeply disturbing path because it will essentially give an incentive for all these coal and fossil fuel companies to just keep digging like crazy. And it is happening because under Obama administration, coal export has tripled and India and China will keep burning coal at an enormous rate. But going back to Joshua's point, I think one of the big problems of IPCC process has generally been that, is that framing it within a very narrow confines of carbon emissions. And even this report is primarily framed around how do we reduce carbon emissions. The issue is much larger than carbon emissions. It's really our consumptive way of life. So that's sort of the, and then later on we can perhaps talk about the biofuel issue also, which this report supports. But that's my takeaway on the carbon sequestration or critique of the carbon sequestration process.
Okay, and Josh, the IPCC has said that this is merely a roadmap and what governments and policy do with it is up to them. Now, in your book, Behind the Curve, you argue that the science-first approach has been an impediment to addressing climate change. Can you explain briefly your thesis as well as the role of the IPCC in the politics of climate change?
Sure, and just to be clear, the thesis is not that we don't need science. I think clearly we do. The issue is that for the first 50 years of dealing with the climate change issue, we've taken the approach toward advocacy that what we need is more and better scientific information, and that will drive more and better policy. And that has essentially shaped the approach of groups from the individual scientists who are lobbying for studies and proposals for policy on climate change since the late 1950s and early 1960s, up through the Sierra Club's approach in the 1990s, through most of the international approaches today. And it was necessary, I think, for the first 50 years. But at a certain point, when that process began to look like it was going to be successful, anybody savvy about how politics works realized they didn't have to have a real political conversation about the effects of mitigating CO2 on things like fossil fuels or energy use. And instead, they could just relocate that political discussion in the science itself. And the IPCC is sort of the poster child for this kind of process. So the IPCC is developed in the late 1980s and implemented in 1990 as a scientific consensus-making body to support the conclusions of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it was very clear that it was meant to support a policy framework. There's an international treaty. Everybody immediately knew, because this is the way they drew it up, that the weaker the IPCC consensus could be, the weaker the UNFCCC would be. And so a number of representatives from different nations, as well as representatives from industry, went to those meetings and began to undercut the science. And so the science-first approach through the IPCC, that we're going to make better science in order to facilitate better policy, has invited a discussion about the science that really undercuts the credibility of the science in the first place, but also has us talking always about science has us focused on things like carbon dioxide very, very specifically and exclusively, rather than thinking about the real political choices we have to make that involve, as Subhankar said, a much broader set of factors. I think the recent report bucks that trend a little bit, but for the most part, I think this has to do with what we expect from the IPCC rather than what the IPCC is delivering. It's easy to be critical of a body that doesn't do the things it wasn't originally tasked to do, which is to deal with how climate change fits into all these other social systems. It's increasingly decided that is its own task, but for the most part, that's not what the IPCC is meant to do. And I think relying too heavily on the IPCC and other science-first bodies that are meant to drive policy, rather than starting to tackle at a very sort of local and regional level what the policy moves are going to have to be to solve this problem, I think it's failed in the past, and I don't see it succeeding if that's our exclusive approach in the future.
Joshua Howe and Subhankar Banerjee, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Anton.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.